The reading this morning is from The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. We are fundamentally social creatures. Our brains are wired to foster working and playing together. Trauma devastates the social engagement system and interferes with cooperation, nurturing, and the ability to function as a productive member of the clan. Many mental health problems, from drug addiction to self-injurious behavior, start off as attempts to cope with emotions that become unbearable because of a lack of adequate human contact and support. Yet institutions that deal with traumatized children and adults all too often bypass the emotional engagement system that is the foundation of who we are, and instead focus narrowly on correcting faulty thinking and on suppressing unpleasant emotions and troublesome behaviors. People can learn to control and change their behavior, but only if they feel safe enough to experiment with new solutions. The body keeps the score. If trauma is encoded in heartbreaking and gut-wrenching sensations, then our first priority is to help people move out of fight or flight status, reorganize their perception of danger, and manage relationships. Where traumatized children are concerned, the last things we should be cutting from school schedules are the activities that can do precisely that. Chorus, physical education, recess, and anything else that involves movement, play, and other forms of joyful engagement. Trauma constantly confronts us with our fragility and with man's inhumanity to man, but also with our extraordinary resilience. I have been able to do this work for so long because it drew me to explore our sources of joy, creativity, meaning, and connection. All the things that make life worth living. There are 4 fundamental truths. 1, our capacity to destroy one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. Restoring relationships and community is central to restoring well-being. 2, language gives us the power to change ourselves and others by communicating our experiences, helping us to define what we know and finding a common sense of meaning. 3, we have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including some of the so-called involuntary functions of the body and brain, through such basic activities as breathing, moving, and touching. And 4, we can change social conditions to create environments in which children and adults can feel safe and where they can thrive.
When I first started here at USR nearly 6 years ago, I led the meditation and prayer time as I had always done. Often, I began by saying, find a comfortable position for your body. It was part of the structure I had learned, and it had become part of my routine. And then one day, I think it was in my first year, one of you came to me and said, whenever you say find a comfortable position, it sends me out of the moment. This person said, I have fibromyalgia and no position is a comfortable position. And I suppose it would have been easy for me to dismiss it and to think it's one person and they're being sensitive, they can just, figure it out for themselves. And then I wouldn't have had to change anything, but that would have been dismissive, right? And it was just as easy to change the language just a tiny bit and say, find as comfortable a position as you can for your body, right? To change my language just that tiny bit to indicate that I know full well that when we gather, there is a range of human experience in this room, and all of it is welcome. There's no pressure, there's no should. And I knew nothing would be lost in others' experience by that change. I'm not even sure any of the rest of you even noticed, right? Maybe one of you did and felt momentarily some kind of way, but that would be nothing compared to increasing the welcome for folks for whom that change mattered. So for years now, because of what one of you shared of your struggles, your ongoing trauma, we might say, and the way that my language was impacting or triggering you, I've started our meditation time with that. Did anyone even notice? Okay, good. Some people did notice. That's great. Now, this was something that also happened for me with the language of breathing during the meditation time. At some point during the last 10 years of my life in full-time ministry, I was taught or became clued into the idea that instructing people to breathe deeply or to just breathe without giving them any out can trigger trauma for some. That the language of relax, just breathe, it'll be okay, can be the language of abusers. And that it was a small thing from my position to change the meditation language from breathe deeply as an instruction to breathe in ways that are okay for you, in ways that your body can, in ways that feel safe for you. The same with the invitation to close your eyes. It's not an instruction, but an invitation offered for you to accept according to your own sense of safety in the world. Again, these are changes that cost nothing and that potentially mean all the difference for those for whom certain language is impactful. These changes make our space more inclusive, more welcoming, more safe. These kinds of awarenesses and changes are what we might call trauma-informed changes. One of my colleagues, the Reverend Elizabeth Stevens, has done some academic work on trauma and had this to say in an interview with UUA staff. She said, quote, "Trauma at its root is any experience that shatters our experience of reality. So it breaks us open, it breaks us apart, it causes a rupture in our self-understanding and our understanding of how the world works. Pretty much everybody experiences trauma at some point or another in their life," she says. "One of the things that is important to understand is that trauma is a physiological response, not a cognitive response. It's something that lives in our body, and so we can't think our way through it. But we can come up with cognitive strategies to move through the physiological response. And that's the work we would call metabolizing. We could call it working with trauma so that we can deal with a physiological response in more skillful ways." That's what Reverend Stevens says. To nuance that, we can turn to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book from which our reading came this morning. That book is titled "The Body Keeps the Score." Dr. van der Kolk spent decades treating victims of trauma. He was at the forefront of changes in treatment plans for war veterans and abuse survivors, conducting his research and work as the landscape of psychology and psychiatry changed, and the use of medication came to play a greater role in how we approach mental health. He notes that trauma, by definition, is overwhelming, nearly unbearable. But as he also noted in the reading that Laura did this morning, humans are wildly resilient and always have been. His account of the history of his field in relation to trauma makes clear that it has taken us a long time to realize and to come to grips with what trauma is and how it impacts our whole beings. It's a long book, but it's a good read. Van der Kolk chronicles the way his field integrated and adjusted and at times resisted new information about trauma and its impact. And he clearly describes what we have come to know now. He writes, "Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present." So essentially, something happens. An experience of war, an experience of violence or violation, abuse, anything that renders a person feeling helpless, unsafe in their vulnerability, without control. And it literally alters the way our mind works and how our brains function. And it impacts the body as well, how our body responds instinctively, its level of stress hormones, and how they diffuse when an acute danger has passed. It alters the way our body is able to function. We've come to understand and to name a complex of behaviors that are linked to the lasting impact of trauma. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder now. While it can be easy to understand and to see how wartime atrocities might create trauma or how childhood abuse would, we don't always consider the different ways that different individuals might experience trauma. This is to say, there aren't only a handful of ways that folks end up suffering from PTSD. Many different things can cause it, from isolated individual events of horror to chronic incidents that if they were individual, we might brush off, but when they compound, become trauma. We've historically had a tendency to try and judge who gets to claim trauma and PTSD and who should just get over it, right? We don't always, as a society or in the medical field, as van der Kolk notes, do a good enough job of listening to and believing one another, or of recognizing, and this is key, that different humans experience the same things differently. I suspect that many of you have encountered in the last decade or so conversations about the idea of being triggered or trigger warnings. And I imagine that you have also encountered the word snowflake, yeah? That term snowflake is a derogatory one used to say that someone thinks their needs are more important than anyone else's, or used to say that someone thinks they're special and unique, like a snowflake, when really they're just like everybody else. It implies someone is too easily offended or too emotional or too entitled. In my experience, it's often applied to progressive folks by conservative folks to claim that progressive folks are taking things too seriously, being ridiculous. It's a little bit like the next jump from that whole PC thing from a couple decades ago, right? It's a way to denigrate as absurd the need for concern, right, and compassion. Often the accusation of snowflake is leveled at those who endorse the idea of trigger warnings or content warnings. The idea being that only a snowflake who is super sensitive would need a trigger warning, right? The idea that being offered trigger warnings is babying people and giving into their entitlement and their ridiculousness. That the world is the way it is and people need to face it and deal with it, and who cares if it upsets them. So my tone should have already given it away, but cards on the table, I hate the term snowflake and the way it's used. And I actually think that trigger warnings are very reasonable in most cases. And here's why. I don't actually believe that harm and suffering is the only route to growth. I don't believe that harm and suffering and our ability to take it prove that we're grown-ups or prove that we're tough. We all know that life is full of harm and suffering. And yes, we know that we can learn and grow from it, but every single thing doesn't have to be harm and suffering. And when we have the capacity to protect each other, why wouldn't we? If I know I'm preaching about challenging material or telling a challenging story, why wouldn't I try to protect those among us for whom it would be distressing and overwhelming by letting them know first? PTSD isn't a cognitive and rational thing. Our experience of trauma can't be logicked around. It is a whole body, whole human experience that takes a holistic approach to heal. So why would we work against that if we have another option? We claim this as a safe space. It's what we want to create and provide here. We want to make this a safe place. And so we have to consider how our words, our focus, our actions impact each other. And we have to do it without judging the other as weak or sensitive or overly emotional, because we don't know what goes on in another's heart and mind. What I might experience as inconvenience, another might experience as trauma. And it's not mine to decide how another human gets to interpret and experience their life. And it certainly isn't mine to pretend I know what another's life has been. We don't know who is suffering and who is not. What we do know is that we live in a time of great disturbance. There's chronic gun violence in America that leaves us all feeling vulnerable and lacking control. There's racism and racially based murders that leave people of color with a daily sense of having to just get through and survive. There are untold numbers of people in this country who are the survivors of abuse of all kinds that we don't acknowledge because it's a source of shame or fear for us collectively. And then there are those global scale traumas that we live with, our awareness of our history of slavery, our awareness of ongoing genocide and war around the world, climate change, the pandemic of the last few years. And then there's the expected trauma of human living, grief and loss and undesired change. Trauma, in whatever way it lasts and stays with us, touches all of us. And the studies show that we hold it and we live with it, not that it ever goes away completely. It changes us. This is not to say we can't heal, but it's not as if treatment happens and suddenly we're exactly who we were before. It's also the case that each of us heals in different ways. In that quote that I shared at the beginning, Reverend Stevens uses the word metabolize. This word is used wisely, including by Resmaa Menakem in his work on trauma titled My Grandmother's Hands. This term tries to capture the idea that trauma isn't just of the mind, but of the whole being, and that we have to work through it in kind of the same way that we digest food. We break it down in order to absorb it. And it doesn't totally leave us, we integrate it. All of us metabolize at different speeds in different ways. Menakem's work focuses on how slavery and ongoing racism creates trauma in all of us here in America, that the routine and everyday oppression and prejudice in our country creates a trauma response that all of us carry in all different ways. There are so many statistics that I could throw at you right now about abuse, oppression, racism, violence against women, anti-Semitism, and so much more. And some of it you know, and some of it would surprise you. But the point is, not only is it possible, but it is almost certain that everyone you meet has suffered some sort of trauma and is carrying it around in their body. There's a concept that I've heard called the window of tolerance. That term comes from Dr. Dan Siegel. And then also I've heard it called the productive zone. I don't know if you've heard these terms before. It's essentially the idea that some amount of stress is good, productive, helps us grow and change. If we have too little stress, we withdraw, we shut down, we don't function well, we don't grow. We have the potential to become numb. If we have too much stress, we become overstimulated. Our hearts race, anxiety takes over, overwhelm is driving us. Either side of the window of tolerance or the productive zone is less than ideal. And when we've suffered trauma, our productive zone gets smaller. Our window of tolerance is smaller. We can handle less. Living is harder. So it's a narrow band, potentially, a tiny spot, potentially, where we can be challenged and grow rather than becoming completely overwhelmed or frozen. But you can grow your productive zone. You can grow your window of tolerance. We can actually heal and increase it. Again, this doesn't mean erasing the experience or getting back to exactly who we were. It means integrating our stories, reclaiming our bodies and our wholeness. It means pursuing with our whole selves a future that acknowledges our trauma but isn't ruled by it. It means metabolizing our experiences. It isn't easy, obviously. Van der Kolk lists, and in later portions of the book describes in detail, the three basic ways we have to approach trauma and its treatment. First is what we might classically have called the talking cure, learning to tell the story, articulating our feelings to others, reconnecting to other humans and processing the information of our own lives. The second is the proper and judicious use of medicine. We have made amazing advances in our understanding of and deployment of medications, and they are absolutely part of the healing process. And the third that he notes is to create opportunities for bodily experiences that help people reassert control, that cultivate a sense of safety. This three-pronged approach is used to help metabolize trauma and heal folks from the harm caused by events beyond their control. One important truth here is that metabolizing trauma is very hard to do when the trauma is ongoing. Okay, so healing trauma while still acutely experiencing it, pretty hard to do. So we need to be out of the acute trauma, and then healing is best accomplished by telling our stories and reconnecting to others, by using appropriate medication, and by having bodily experiences, whole person experiences of control and safety. Now, all of that matters, and understanding it matters because it helps us to better understand our collective role. Because although the work of healing from trauma is work an individual undertakes, all of us have a role to play. Trauma can't be worked through easily while it is ongoing. This means, as a society, we have to find ways to end childhood abuse, end racial oppression, end violent misogyny, end the horrors of war, end the devastation of gun violence. Collectively, we have to care about reducing the trauma that we can reduce in this world. We have to start caring more about protecting each other with our votes, our money, our actions. We have to stop caring more about our own rights as we perceive them than about our fellow humans' right to safety and liberty and healing. On the big political stage, we have to work to limit the trauma our fellow humans experience. And that will take us becoming ever more attentive and attuned to others. Trauma is helped by telling our stories and reconnecting. We have to stop judging each other for our experiences and our reactions to those experiences. We have to stop assuming we know what things feel like for one another or what they should feel like. Instead, we have to listen to each other's stories of trauma and harm, especially across difference, right? Especially across differences of gender, race, religion, age. And we have to believe one another and then act accordingly. Because adjusting my language, if it helps another to not be sent viscerally back into their moment of trauma, then that's my job. I change my language. I do what I can to protect my fellow humans. If using someone's correct pronouns protects them from additional harm, then we use their correct pronouns. We don't have to ask questions, right? We eliminate words and phrases from our vocabulary because they can harm others. We warn people if we're about to share a story that could cause them trauma, and we listen when someone tells us that something we're doing or saying hurts. We have to stop privileging our right to do and say whatever we want over other people's truths and trauma and healing. Trauma is eased by the use of medication. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, if you didn't know. We have to erase the stigma we have lived with and promoted for so long. We have to make mental health care and medications available and accessible economically and geographically. We have to truly believe and live the truth that medication that helps our brains is no different than medication that helps our physical bodies. We have to let go of the white supremacist, Puritan, European thing that says that we should be able to control ourselves completely and will our way through it. We have to acknowledge the interdependence of brain and body, the wholeness of our humanity, and treat it medically as needed, without shame or blame or judgment. We have to be able to speak in public spaces about the reality of our mental health and the mental health crises in our country. And we need to react to each other's needs and truths with grace and generosity and kindness. Trauma can be healed by bodily experiences of safety and control. We have to realize that all the time we spend together here at USR, out there at PTA meetings, community events with your family, anytime we gather in groups with others, all of those are an opportunity to do what is termed collective healing. In that same interview, Reverend Stevens notes that we have evolved as a species to be co-regulating. She clarifies this by saying, co-regulation basically means that as a species, we evolved to help each other do the work of metabolizing trauma, of managing our physiological responses to trauma, to danger. We help each other calm down. We help bring one another back to our best selves, to that which is most human, back to kindness and compassion, empathy and connection, all things that we can sometimes lose our grasp on when we're in the throes of that physiological trauma response. Community, ritual, they help us do this collective healing, this co-regulation. Trauma can feel isolating, even collective trauma, and coming together in places of safety and consent that enable both vulnerability and control in a place of love and welcome remind us that we aren't alone. We're connected, and that matters for healing. Breathing together, but each on our own terms. Singing, each in our own way. Sharing, each as we feel welcome. Being invited in and treated with respect and care. Being reminded that our whole selves, including our bodies, are beautiful. Living deeply into the resilience of the human heart, these are experiences of wholeness and healing. Each of us has a role to play in the mitigation of harm, and each of us has a role to play in healing our own and our collective. And this community we have built and that we share has a role too, a vital one. We can never forget that as we seek our own wholeness and a better world for all people, places like this make a difference. So as you feel comfortable over the rest of the course of the month of May, I invite you to consider how you approach trauma, your own and others. I invite you to read more, become trauma-informed, or more trauma-informed if you already know. Talk here with us about what you're learning. Consider how you might increase your participation in healing. May we continue to encourage in each other our full humanity. May we continue to listen to each other's stories with open hearts and no judgment. May we continue to cultivate a space of safety and consent. And may we find ever new ways to offer one another opportunities for healing. So may it be.